The opening of a story-driven video game carries more responsibilities than any other piece of any other medium. Not only does the beginning of a game need to introduce the story's setting, characters, and motifs, but it also has to hook the player's interest, both narratively and mechanically, whilst teaching them how to play the game. All in the shortest amount of time as to not delay players who just want to play the video game already. After all, not every player is necessarily playing the game for the first time. How can a game juggle the setting of a story and entertaining a player who may or may not already know what's going on, and which games do the best job of starting off? For the sake of the watchability of this video, we're going to condense all those responsibilities into a much more manageable number. The way I see it, there are three necessary elements to an effective opening to a game: establishing the narrative hook, minimizing tutorial time without compromising on information, and developing mechanical engagement. First off, a game needs a narrative hook. This is the part of the story that catches the player's interest, tells them what the story is about, and tells them why they should stick around for it. According to the monomyth, the beginning of a hero's journey sets up a status quo that is then broken by some antagonistic force. Once a point is scored for the baddies, the player is inspired to make amends or get revenge. A common mistake is to spend too much time establishing the regular world through something like a voiceover or a plot dump before starting up proper. Directly addressing the audience is not very compelling, and players won't care about a story unless there is a dilemma to solve or an injustice to make right. So before a game spends too much time on its world building, it needs to get to the conflict if it wants to hook the player effectively. Next, a game needs to teach the player the mechanics effectively without dragging. Here the game educates the player how to play and sets them loose. Now, there are a lot of ways to set up a tutorial, but for an interesting opening, it's best to avoid something tedious like a wall of text, or step-by-step instructions that just tell the player how to overcome a challenge. Ideally, there should be an easy filter puzzle in a safe environment that requires a singular solution that the player can chip away at until they learn what needs to be learnt. It's also important not to over-tutorialize. Once the player knows how to dodge an attack, the game doesn't need to make them go through it 3 more times. It can just throw them into combat. If they die, just have the checkpoint be back before the filter puzzle. Furthermore, the difficulty curve can slowly bubble up as the game goes on, meaning that the tutorial doesn't necessarily have to cover everything. If the beginning of a game can give the player a string to pull on, then they can unravel the intricacies of the mechanics as the game winds on. Finally, we have to engage the player mechanically. For simplicity, you could call this the mechanical hook. Now that the player knows how to play the game, they need to know why they should play the game. It's time to excite the player with possibilities and demonstrate why this idea best fits this medium. You can recognize a mechanical hook as the first part of the game to truly feel open and variable, or the first instance of one of the game's most prominent features. It's the first real obstacle or explorable area that lets the player stretch their wings. Towards the end of level 1-1 or the beginning of 1-2, it's important for the video game to start being a video game. Sounds obvious when I say it like that, but too many games get so distracted with tutorialization or story crafting that they forget the whole point of being interactive in the first place. For example, The Phantom Pain has this really elaborate first mission where the player needs to escape from a hospital raid, all while recovering from a coma. It's incredibly effective at establishing a tense vibe, and it does so while introducing the player to the tools they have available to them. But since it's incredibly linear and incredibly long, it makes for really dull gameplay. It's difficult to achieve all 3 factors of a satisfying game intro without compromising a bit on one of them. So let's take a closer look at a couple more games with extra strong level 1s, to get a better idea on how to juggle all 3 of those responsibilities simultaneously. First off, let's get the obvious one out of the way. Dark Souls' Undead Asylum. The player awakens imprisoned only to be saved by a faceless knight, and pretty much as soon as the player understands the controls, it's time for the first boss. They're free to wail on this guy all day, and while it is possible to beat him, the real solution is to turn tail and attack from a more advantageous position. This is the mechanical hook, the game's thesis. It's a game about navigating a booby-trapped environment where skill can overcome anything, but the dominant strategy is always going to be to maintain situational awareness and defuse ambushes before they happen. As soon as the player escapes, they're given their tutorialization on combat with a hallway sniper that incentivizes defense, and a bit of revenge that teaches offense. Those will later be combined against a small posse of goons. The player then runs back into that knight who gives them their motivation. I died so you could ring the bells and something will happen. There's a sense of debt to this fallen ally and a sense of mystery to the result of the prophecy pushing the player forward narratively. They want to do what's right and they want to see what happens. I realize Dark Souls is kind of a special case though, since it has such a unique way of telling its story. So how about an example from a more cinematic game? Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance has a similar situation with a fight against the Ray. Again, the player has only one room of only the most basic tutorialization before the first boss, except instead of a lesson in futility, it's a celebration of camp, an over-the-top, indulgent, absurdist self-parody. It's a perfect microcosm of the rest of the game, which hooks the player from minute one. As for the narrative hook, that comes right after when Raiden gets knocked around by an actually unbeatable boss, beginning his and the player's quest for, wait for it, Revengeance. To conclude on intros, the best level ones are those that condense the best aspects of a game into a brief teaser of things to come. They establish a world that needs to be made right and present the player with interesting tools to do so with. They teach the player subtly using easy filter puzzles and give them enough detail to unwind the finer details of the game's mechanics without dragging or over-tutorializing. It's fair to say that the beginning of a video game has a lot of responsibilities laid at its feet, but a promising intro is the first step towards a satisfying middle and a spectacular finish.